Morning all. It has been dubbed a betrayal of the North and the great train robbery by the likes of senior Tory MPs, regional leaders and industry figures, all of them angry that the eastern leg of HS2 has been axed and a downgrading of a high-speed rail line across northern England. Well, let's speak now to the man who unveiled the government's integrated rail plan, the Transport Secretary, Grant Shapps, joining us from Salford. Mr Shapps, good to see you this morning.
Morning.
Clearly, an announcement of significance yesterday, but not perhaps quite as significant as many had been led to believe. Can you just explain why the eastern leg of HS2 is now not going ahead and why that high-speed rail link between Leeds and Manchester, similarly, will not be going ahead as promised?
Well, that's just not accurate reporting, actually. This is a £96 billion package. It's the first time spending that sort of money is being called a robbery. £96 billion package. It does include 3 new high-speed lines. That's from Crewe to Manchester, from Warrington across to the west of Yorkshire, and a new line from Birmingham to Nottingham and Derby. So there are 3 new sections of high-speed line. There are nearly 400 miles of electrification of line, lots of other upgrades, including digital signalling. And actually, the thing that will matter to people in the end is if you are in Manchester, which is where I am this morning, you'll have a 33-minute journey across to Leeds. If you're in Bradford, you'll have a 12-minute journey to Leeds. So we're talking now about some really fast journey times due to this multi-billion-pound package of upgrades and spending and high-speed lines.
I mean, I might be forgetting things, but the Prime Minister, to my recollection, stood in Manchester next to a train and said, I'm going to deliver on my commitment to that vision with a pledge to fund the Leeds to Manchester route. You yourself, at a policy exchange event 6 months ago, said, we are going to complete HS2 and include HS2 on the eastern leg to Leeds. Those were both promises made by you and the Prime Minister. Those promises have not been fulfilled. Why not?
They're absolutely being fulfilled. First of all, we're producing that around 30-minute journey from Manchester to Leeds, or to give you another example, Manchester to Liverpool in 35 minutes. So we're giving that interconnectivity. We said we wanted to create that kind of connection that you would have, perhaps if it was in the south, in the north. And when it comes to HS2, we're going to deliver HS2 trains, and look, the best way to do that into Leeds. The plan for HS2 was conceived 15 years and more ago, and we always said what we want to do is make sure it actually integrates with these plans for Northern Powerhouse Rail, which we are building. That is the line which goes across, and including high-speed rail, which will make those dramatic journey time differences, as well as Midlands, what's called the Midlands Rail Hub, the ability to connect the Midlands up much better. So, for example, you'd be able to travel from our biggest cities in the Midlands, Birmingham, say, to Nottingham in under half an hour, that sort of thing. So 27 minutes. So, you know, this is a massive plan. It spends £96 billion. Over 50 billion of that is new money into this plan. And so everywhere, no matter where you are, you're going to get, as good or better journey times nearly everywhere across the Midlands and North. It's really actually great news.
Minister, and you are very free to argue that point.
And
you're very free to argue that point. But the level of cognitive dissonance on display this morning is nothing if not impressive. Did or did not the Prime Minister say to the Commons this year, I can certainly confirm that we're going to develop the eastern leg as well as the whole of HS2?
Which is exactly what we're doing. And I think that's been misunderstood, the way that's been created. So the eastern leg will be developed. As I said, there'll be a brand new high-speed line. I think it covers about 35% of the distance. We'll then look to utilise and upgrade, for example, the Midland Main Line. So if you were taking the journey to Sheffield, it will be exactly the same under this plan as it would have been under the original HS2 plan. But Sheffield and many other places will be served in between. So this is now bringing in a lot more communities who wouldn't have had the benefits of high speed with this measure. And as I say, there's £100 million in there, not only to look at how to take trains, HS2 trains, I should say, into Leeds, but also how to give Leeds a transit system, because actually it's the biggest city in Europe without its own transit system. So all of that and much else is included in here. And the only disconnect are some of the complaints from, I have to say, largely Labour leaders who are completely misleading people, because when they actually look at the list of journey times, what their residents will see is they'll be able to get around a lot faster from virtually every place to virtually every place.
I have to say, I think the idea that it's only Labour leaders that have been criticising this is similarly wide of the mark, Minister. Hugh Merriman, your colleague from the Conservative Party who chairs the Transport Select Committee, accused the Prime Minister of selling perpetual sunlight and then leaving it to others to explain the arrival of moonlight. Robbie Moore, another 2019 Tory intake MP, he said that the region has been left completely shortchanged. Ministers need to do much, much more. Kevin Hollinrake said that Bradford will be paying an economic price for generations. Sir Edward Lee now describing HS2 as a white elephant now without a leg. I mean, these are colleagues of yours within the Conservative Party. I can list regional mayors as well, all of whom who say that this plan is a retrograde step. Name me a city in the north that is welcoming the changes to the plans.
Right. First of all, a lot of the names you mentioned, Sir Ed Lee, for example, have been long-term opponents of HS2. So, you know, there are people who you're quoting and only partially quoting, because in each of those cases they also went on to welcome different aspects. The thing about rail is, you know, if the train service doesn't come to your community, then quite rightly you will always speak up about it. But, for example, that quote about Bradford is simply wrong. A 12-minute journey to go from Bradford to Leeds. 12 minutes. This connects these two great northern cities up in a way that, you know, even towns in the south are not connected up. This is far better. In terms of mayors, to answer your challenge, let me just finish answering your question. Let me just, hold on. Let me answer your last question before we go on to the next one.
And said it was a betrayal.
Let me answer your last question.
City.
You asked me the last question. Let me answer it. Name you some mayors. You said you gave me the challenge. Yes, I was with Andy Street yesterday. Birmingham, a big winner in this. Nottingham, a big winner. Derby does very well.
Anything north of that?
Mayors yes, of course, Ben Houchen, who I spoke to yesterday about this. That's
HS2,
fantastic.
according to Ben Houchen, is now a waste of money and should be
billions
scrapped.
of pounds. Ben Houchen was never in favour of HS2. It never was going to run to Tees Valley. But what he massively welcomes, and I don't think we've even discussed yet, is the billions of pounds of upgrades to the East Coast Main Line, things like the digitisation of signalling, which will mean that those journey times anywhere up the East Coast, even into Scotland, will be massively improved by this investment. And really, the only disconnect here is £96 billion being spent, virtually every area receiving as good or better service than would have been under the original plans, and then anyone really saying, oh, we don't get anything out of this. It's simply not true. You know, Manchester to Leeds, 33 minutes. I mean, that is a huge improvement from where we are. You know, Manchester to Liverpool, 35 minutes. These are massive improvements from where we are at the moment, and they complete a northern powerhouse rail, which includes high-speed lines.
Just to reiterate, though, Newcastle not supporting it, Liverpool not supporting it, Leeds, Manchester, Sheffield, Bradford, as I just quoted, none of them are particularly happy with this. I mean, I was speaking last night to the editor of the Yorkshire Post, who actually had carried an article by the Prime Minister yesterday morning. I just don't believe that you understand the depth of anger that exists this morning about another U-turn by this government. He told me this is a betrayal of the North as severe as Mrs Thatcher's decimation of northern industry in the 1980s.
Well, look, I mean, if you are in Newcastle, then be aware that rather than it taking 81 minutes, so an hour and 21, it will take an hour and a quarter to get from, say, Newcastle to Leeds, and that's without taking into account the massive advantages of the electrifications further south as well, and the digitisation. So this will have been the only time in history where massively improving everybody's rail services would have been counted as a betrayal. It's a strange approach, but if you live in those areas, I urge you to download the integrated rail plan rather than listening to what these people are saying. Download the integrated rail plan. Pages 18 and 19 will list your town or city, and it will show the speed of improvement for the journey that you'll now be getting. And if you still feel betrayed by being able to get to other places much, much quicker, then you probably will agree with whoever said that. Otherwise, you'll probably be grateful and happy that you can get around much, much faster because of this enormous investment.
The problem, though, with what you have just said about ignoring these people, you know, the reason it's difficult for people to ignore them is because they've elected them. But just on the point of increased speed, the Prime Minister said yesterday, in virtually every station along the line, it's either faster or the same. Your own document lists 28 routes. By my counting, 5 have faster journey times under the new plan, 4 have the same times, 19 have worse times. 5 of those are within 10%, so you could say that they're similar. So just in terms of the assertion that everyone along this line will be seeing speedier travel, I mean, that's just a lie.
I don't recognise your figures. I've got 2 pages here. You can see I've torn them out of the report. It lists a lot more places than you just mentioned right off the bat. So I don't recognise what you're saying. Virtually everywhere gets much better services than was envisaged under the original HS2 plan, which, as I say, other than the fact it's sort of obviously ripped through the countryside, there'll be an awful lot of people this morning who will be relieved. But other than that, there are just massive journey time improvements. And as I say, half an hour or thereabouts journeys from Manchester to Liverpool, from Manchester to Leeds. These are real improvements. Oh, and there's one other thing I should mention. Rather than these being delivered in the never time, because previously these wouldn't have come about till the 2040s, these are upgrades which are starting this Christmas and will be delivered in many cases during this decade. So rather than having to wait forever, people will get the advantages much sooner. I do encourage people to actually take a look at the document itself, because I think they'll get a very, very different picture.
I would encourage them to do exactly the same. But can we just focus for a second on the money and the £96 billion figure that understandably you're pretty pleased of? Isn't the truth of that, 42 billion of that has already been allocated for HS2 from London to Birmingham and Crewe? So actually the additional funds that we're talking about here are roughly in the region of 54 billion. I think you'd accept that. But actually,
and we're upfront about that, and we say that in the document, yes.
Great. Estimates vary, but with the full HS2 and NPR network, as you previously promised, we were looking at perhaps as much as 185 billion. Now, you may well contest that figure, but it is a statement of fact that as a result of the U-turn that you and the Prime Minister performed, tens of billions of pounds less will be spent in the north.
There was never a figure of 185, but I do, broadly speaking, accept that if you were to just do everything that everybody has ever mentioned, it would come to about 185 billion. Clearly would not be affordable in terms of other priorities for the country, and whether you'd have to take that out of health or education or welfare or something else, it clearly could never have been delivered at 185 billion pounds. And I just want to repeat the central argument here. First of all, when you look at the figures, wherever you live in the country, if you're in the Midlands or North, take a look at what your journey times will be. You'll see they're likely to be at least the same or largely much better than they are today, with really quick journey times. I mentioned things like Bradford to Leeds in 12 minutes, which I think people will massively welcome. The second thing is you won't have to wait until the 2040s to see these improvements. These improvements will start coming much faster during this decade. And again, I think that matters to people more than some dream of something which may never, ever occur, or in so many decades' time, and as you rightly point out, would bankrupt the country in the meantime.
Given that both you and the Prime Minister have, within recent memory, promised that eastern leg of HS2, which is not going ahead, that new line between Leeds and Manchester, which is not going ahead, on what basis should we believe any of the promises that you're making this morning?
OK, so we are building, just to correct you again, we are building more HS2 line on the eastern leg, so from Birmingham eastwards towards Nottingham to Derby. By the way, unlike the original plans, it will actually go town centre to town centre, so those are more journeys that dramatically speed up. They're actually faster between Birmingham and Nottingham, Birmingham, than you would have had under the original plans. And then with the upgrades that we're doing, the Midland Main Line, all across the East Coast, the journey times to many of the locations are identical to the ones that we would have had with sort of full-fat HS2, if you like, so Sheffield, for example, in about the same time. And then we are, in this plan, going to be looking at studying how to get those HS2 trains into Leeds. So I think you're rather overselling that disappearing. That is still there. And we're going to do all of this much sooner, 10, 15 years sooner than the original plan would have delivered. So if you are a rail user and you are hearing this argument, don't take my word for it, don't take your word for it, go and look at the document, go and look at the journey times, and you'll see the massive improvements which are being provided.
Minister, always good to have you on the programme. Thanks for your time.
Likewise. Thanks.
Now, to return to our top story, representatives of all 18 first-class counties, as well as the England and Wales Cricket Board, will be meeting at the Oval today in the wake of the racism scandal that has engulfed the sport. The former cricketer, Azeem Rafiq, gave a devastating account to MPs this week of the racism he endured at Yorkshire Cricket Club. But yesterday, he himself apologised for anti-Semitic slurs contained in text messages he sent back in 2011. Now, let's take you through the timeline of events. Last year, Azeem Rafiq made allegations of racism against Yorkshire County Cricket Club, saying it left him close to taking his own life. In the same month, the club launched an investigation into those allegations. Almost a year on, Yorkshire received the findings of the report but did not release them. The following month, a summary of the findings and recommendations of the independent report was published, saying that Azeem Rafiq was the victim of racial harassment and bullying. Yet despite this, at the end of October, Yorkshire County Cricket Club said it would take no disciplinary action against any of its employees, players or executives. A number of sponsors ended their partnerships with the club, including Nike and Yorkshire Tea. So, senior figures at the club, including Chairman Roger Hutton, resigned following widespread condemnation from individuals, including the Prime Minister and the Health Secretary. Earlier this week, Mr Rafiq gave evidence to MPs on the Commons Digital Culture, Media and Sport Select Committee. Let's bring in Sky's Shingi Marariki, joining us from the Oval in South London this morning. Shingi, good to see you. A meeting of some significance for the sport.
That's right, Neil. This morning, representatives of the 18 first-class sides and the ECB will meet here at the Oval. They'll be discussing what they call a one-point agenda, looking at diversity and inclusion in the game. But the pressure is quite clearly on. No one will forget Azeem Rafiq's testimony earlier in the week in Parliament, in which he spoke about the sport being institutionally racist, and he mentioned a number of instances in which he himself had encountered discrimination. But, of course, yesterday the news emerged that he himself had sent a series of anti-Semitic messages to a teammate, Atiq Javeed, in 2011, while later on this morning, to just give you a sense of how much of this sort of news is emerging, Alex Hales, an England player, was pictured on the front page of a newspaper wearing blackface. He says that that was a tribute to a popular rapper, but he has obviously been condemned by a number of anti-racism groups already. And all of these things are why this meeting later on here at the Oval matters. The wider culture of cricket is underneath the spotlight, and a number of people will be calling for the leading figures in the game to take action to root out racism as quickly as possible.
An independent parliamentary watchdog says that the government was not fully prepared for the wide-ranging impact the COVID pandemic had on society. The National Audit Office found previous plans that could have helped preparation weren't properly implemented. Aisha Sahid has been taking a closer look.
Seeing friends and family is something we've all got used to again after the country stood still for months on end, and these became familiar scenes. High streets were empty, shops closed, and classrooms virtual. Disruption that could have been minimised had the government been more prepared, according to a new report.
The pandemic really exposed weaknesses in government's approach to emergencies like COVID-19, which are so broad that they touch on every aspect of public life. So whilst government had prepared for a flu pandemic and an emerging high-consequence disease, and was able to use some of this planning for its COVID-19 response, it had not prepared a specific response for COVID-19.
The government says it always followed scientific advice.
We will make sure the NHS gets all the support it needs to continue their brilliant response to the virus so far. The plan does not set out what the government will do. It sets out the steps that we could take at the right time and on the basis of the scientific advice. Our country remains extremely well prepared.
But problems came to light very early on, from shortages of PPE, a lockdown that came too late, and an overwhelmed NHS.
I wouldn't call it naivety when it comes to not anticipating a pandemic of this scale in the UK. I would actually probably call it arrogance. I think we felt that we were so sufficiently prepared and we had such a robust health system that we could deal with anything. And to our detriment, because I think we were very slow to lock down because of that.
While the pandemic is far from over, COVID-19 has very much become a part of our everyday lives. And with a busy festive season ahead, focus is on what happens next.
With rising case numbers, experts have concerns over what the next few months could look like. But people here in Soho hope restrictions are kept at bay.
My main thing is I do not want to be locked down again. I think it is going to get worse over Christmas, but I think everyone's accepting of that, and we've just got to find a way to live with it now.
I think bringing back restrictions now doesn't make sense based on the fact that everyone's vaccinated and hospitals are not buckling like we all thought they were going to.
The biggest question of all remains to be answered: whether or not lessons have truly been learnt. Aisha Zahid, Sky News.
Some of the other stories making the news this morning. And 2 children and 2 women have died in a house fire in Bexley Heath in south-east London. London Fire Brigade says 6 fire engines and around 40 firefighters were called to the blaze last night. All 4 people died at the scene. One other man has been taken to hospital. The cause of the fire is being investigated. India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi says his government will withdraw controversial farm laws that were met with year-long protests. The legislation, which was introduced last year, deregulates the sector, allowing farmers to sell produce to buyers beyond government-regulated wholesale markets. Small farmers said the changes would have made them vulnerable to competition from big business. Serena Williams has joined calls for an investigation into the disappearance of a Chinese tennis player. Peng Shuai has not been publicly seen since accusing China's former vice premier of sexual assault 2 weeks ago. Chinese state media has released a letter attributed to Ms. Peng, but doubts have been raised over its legitimacy. The United States is considering a diplomatic boycott of the Winter Olympic Games being held in Beijing early next year. This decision would act as a protest against China's human rights record, including what Washington describes as a genocide against minority Muslims. The US President Joe Biden says the boycott is something he's considering. The Transport Secretary has told Sky News this morning that the government will fulfil their promise to improve rail services in the north. Now, that's despite the announcement that the eastern leg of HS2 has been cut back, with the Northern Powerhouse rail line also downgraded. Grant Shapps said their promises will still be delivered.
They're absolutely being fulfilled. First of all, we're producing that around 30-minute journey from Manchester to Leeds, or to give you another example, Manchester to Liverpool in 35 minutes. So we're giving that interconnectivity. We said we wanted to create that kind of connection that you would have, perhaps if it was in the south, in the north. And when it comes to HS2, we're going to deliver HS2 trains, and look, the best way to do that into Leeds. The plan for HS2 was conceived 15 years and more ago, and we always said what we want to do is make sure it actually integrates with these plans for Northern Powerhouse Rail, which we are building. That is the line which goes across, and including high-speed rail, which will make those dramatic journey time differences.
Let's bring in our political correspondent, Rob Powell. Good to see you this morning, Rob. Look, if you listened to that interview with the Transport Secretary in full, you'd be forgiven for thinking that absolutely no promises had been broken this morning.
Yeah, there's a line in the Daily Mail this morning, Neil, saying that Grant Shapps could sell sand in the Sahara with a straight face. And I think what we saw in that interview was a prime example, really, of doubling down and not giving an inch. Yeah. Let's be straight. What was announced yesterday is really significant. It's a lot of money, and it will improve journey times. It will change a lot of people's commute. But also, it's not what was promised before, because we are not getting new HS2 track running up to Leeds. Grant Shapps said in that clip that we're going to take HS2 into Leeds. At the moment, there's no HS2 track or trains running into Leeds. It'll stop at Sheffield, and there's a study to figure out how to get it into Leeds. He talked about journey times virtually everywhere improving. That might be something of a surprise if you're waking up in Leeds or York or Darlington or Newcastle this morning. The Leeds-Manchester link will be slower, albeit by, the government says, a matter of minutes. But even the most balanced of commentators on this is still slightly perplexed about how you double capacity between Manchester and Leeds without building a completely new track and running it halfway on existing lines. Grant Shapps also says that the disadvantage with the old plans was we'd be waiting until 2040s for new track. The difficulty with that is that you look at the government's own plan yesterday, and the HS2 line that runs to the East Midlands, the HS2 line that runs to Manchester, you will still be waiting until the 2040s for that. It's the electrification work that comes sooner, but But even on that part of the Transpennine electrification was planned anyway. The Midland Main Line electrification was canned in 2017 by Chris Grayling. So I thought it was an interesting approach, given the scale and palpable anger from across the board in the North this morning, that Grant Shapps this morning seemingly refusing that anything will be less good than what was promised.
Yeah, Chris Grayling might well be looking to see if any royalties are coming his way after the announcement yesterday. For now, though, Rob, we'll speak to you a bit later in the programme. For now, thanks very much indeed. But let's return to cricket. And representative of all 18 first-class counties, as well as the England and Wales Cricket Board, will be meeting at the Oval in the wake of the racism scandal that has engulfed the sport. The former cricketer, Azeem Rafiq, gave a devastating account to MPs this week of the racism he endured at Yorkshire County Cricket Club. But yesterday, he himself apologised for sending anti-Semitic messages in 2011 in a post on social media. Joining us now, the writer and broadcaster Mihir Bose, who is also the author of an upcoming book entitled The Impossible Dream: Can We Ever Have a Non-Racial Sports World? Mihir, good to see you this morning. Do hope you're well.
Very well, thank you.
Can we start with the latest development in a story that, frankly, by my reckoning, has been going for a number of decades, let alone months and weeks? Azeem Rafiq apologising for his own use of anti-Semitic language. What did you make of that?
Well, I think, these things have happened in the past. Azeem Rafiq himself, if you like, went into the past, brought out a number of allegations which have proved, as you said, devastating, and which, of course, extend beyond him. And he himself is, of course, not blameless. And this past hasn't been looked at. And I suspect that more of this will come out of many other cricketers and many other people in the game. And we shouldn't be surprised that we will get more revelations in the days and weeks ahead.
Mihir, I will freely admit that I am not a cricket man. Beyond a couple of boozy days at Headingley and watching Scotland beat England in the one-day World Cup, my experience is pretty limited. You have spent far more time at these grounds. Just how pervasive, in your mind, has racism been in cricket?
Well, what's interesting about cricket is not that the spectators generally are a problem, which is not the case in football, which hasn't been historically the case in football, where when I was first reporting football in the 70s, National Front used to be outside the ground saying, get your colour supplement and things like that. What has happened in cricket, and this is the big thing about cricket, is that it has gone backwards in the sense when I first started reporting cricket in the 70s and 80s, cricket was a very, very multicultural, multiracial sport. England was the place everybody came to play cricket. Viv Richards' great friend was Ian Botham, one man from Antigua, another man couldn't be more English and things like that. Cricket at that level, at the county level, has actually become very white. Not a deliberate policy, but because this is how it's happened. And that is the question. And therefore, dressing rooms are very, very white. So the odd non-white person stands out. And of course, remarks are made and things like that. And one must say that over the years, I've heard cricketers tell me privately of the discrimination and the racism they faced, but they were not prepared to come out because they were worried this might affect their career, how it would affect their standing and so on and so forth. And this is the change, if you like, this new generation who've grown up in the last 20, 25 years, who feel that they ought to come out and talk about it. So I wouldn't say cricket is, absolutely deeply racist, but it hasn't looked at the problem and it has been self-satisfied. There's a complacency glow about cricket. Oh, we're all right. We're doing fine. We don't have any problems with our crowds and things like that. And this is what Rafiq has done, has punctured it.
Well, with a lot of the racism in cricket then taking place behind closed doors, what hope then for the meeting taking place behind closed doors at the Oval today between the ECB and the 15 first-class county clubs? It strikes me that this perhaps is the start of quite a lengthy process.
It is the start of a lengthy process, and this is again cricket, where cricket is different from football. You see, the counties are not self-sufficient without money from the ECB, the governing body. It's not like the Premier League, which is such a huge money monster that it can defy the FA if it wants to. The counties need the ECB money for them, but yet the ECB has shown no leadership. The ECB kept saying about Yorkshire, well, let Yorkshire investigate it. And the ECB said, we saw the testimony of Tom Harrison in the ECB, very pathetic really, in front of the DCMS, saying, well, we are the regulator, we can't do it. So the ECB needs to assert itself. The ECB needs to say what exactly it's doing. And I must say, though his position at the moment is not formally in doubt, that there are questions whether Tom Harrison can carry on as chief executive of the ECB, because he's come under severe pressure since his performance in front of the MPs at the DCMS hearing.
Now, the UK's public spending watchdog has accused the government of being unprepared for the impacts of the pandemic on society. A report from the National Audit Office says that the COVID crisis highlighted the UK's vulnerability to an emergency of such a scale, and says that the government must learn lessons to strengthen national resilience. We're joined now by Gareth Davis from the National Audit Office. Gareth, very good morning to you. Take us through your findings. The report, as I understand it, identifies that this government, like frankly other governments around the world, had a failure of risk assessment.
That's right. I mean, clearly the same findings do apply in many countries around the world. But it's clear that in the UK, we weren't prepared for a pandemic of this kind with these kind of effects. And I mean, one of the reasons that's clear is that this is our 23rd report on the government's response to COVID-19. So we've looked at the furlough scheme, the dealing with the impacts of school closures, and across the whole range of responses. But quite commonly, one of our findings has been there was no plan to deal with this kind of situation. So there was no plan for how to deal with mass school closures. There was no plan for employment support schemes, so the furlough scheme had to be developed from scratch in just a very short number of weeks. So the question that raises is, what is it about the way that the risk planning for these kind of events was carried out that left us unprepared? And as you say, really crucial that the lessons are learned in case of something of this kind, or some other kind of catastrophic event that needs systematic government-wide planning.
What insight then have you gleaned as to why we were so singularly unprepared for this, for a coronavirus pandemic? There has been some work, of course, done in the past on influenza pandemics, but of course, you know, transmissibility varies. Asymptomatic transmissibility is a bigger issue when it comes to coronavirus, and that was a bit of an issue, of course, when it came to our strategising for this.
Of course. And there was also a good detailed plan for a MERS outbreak, which would be, you know, a more infectious, a more fatal outbreak of a disease, so leading to the creation of emergency centres for concentrating those patients and so on. But neither that nor the influenza plan turned out to be exactly what was required in this case. And of course, this is all with the benefit of hindsight, but it's really important that hindsight is used to understand how the planning system needs to change, give us a better chance of being prepared for these kind of diseases. It's also the case, you know, our report sets out that the number of exercises that the government carried out to test its influenza plan and its MERS plan, for example, not all the lessons of those exercises were then implemented in full. Some were, and some of the reasons we were able to move quickly was because of those exercises, but there were gaps. And so one of our recommendations is that the government has a much more systematic method of ensuring that all of the lessons emerging from big exercises of that kind are implemented across government.
On whose shoulders then does blame, if any, is to be apportioned then fall? I mean, quite clearly, you know, since 2005 we've been conducting these risk assessments. Is it the Cabinet Office? Is it other senior figures within the civil service? Is it ministers, perhaps?
I mean, this is a system-wide challenge. So, and our report, the purpose of our report is not to apportion blame. There's clearly going to be a public inquiry next year, and it's not our job to anticipate what a public inquiry might find. Our job is to accumulate the evidence from our audit work and to present that in a factual and balanced way. So this report is part of that effort. But I think in response to your question about where does responsibility lie, it's across the whole system. So the Cabinet Office has lead responsibility for risk management in government through something called the Civil Contingencies Secretariat. That's working hard to understand exactly these lessons at the moment and revise government's approach to risk management in a fundamental way. And our report is designed to assist that process and to help Parliament scrutinise government's work to improve it.
It strikes me then that perhaps Dominic Cummings had a point when he identified the Cabinet Office and other aspects of the civil service of Whitehall as simply not communicating effectively enough. How then, in your mind, can we learn and move forward and ensure that there is that cooperative, collaborative effort across government that you need in the middle of a pandemic?
You really do. I mean, actually, the fact that government has had to respond to this pandemic across all of its functions, and not just central government, but with local authorities, the local resilience forums, as they're called, and business more widely, just shows that this is not something you can contain to one government department or even central government. So the first lesson is government becoming just routinely better at working as a single entity itself and then with its partners across the whole system. And we're about to see, a slower burn, but an equally significant challenge with net zero, for example, where the lessons of this pandemic are actually relevant to how government might make a success of net zero, because it requires concerted action across departmental boundaries with the private sector and with the public. And those are huge challenges, which, again, our reports are designed to help inform.
Well, let's hope that they certainly do. Gareth Davis from the National Audit Office, thanks so much for your time.
Thank you.
Time for us, though, to have a look at the weather.
Look forward to brighter skies. The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.
And it's looking to stay mild into the weekend with rain and gales in the far north, but Sunday looking much colder. For now, though, it is very mild out there, most places dry. Northern Scotland, though, wet and windy, with gales locally severe for the Northern Isles. Rain and strong winds will continue to affect Northern Scotland through the morning, but the gales should clear elsewhere. It'll remain largely dry if windy in the north, but western hills will be at risk of drizzly rain.
The weather, sponsored by Qatar Airways.